Welcome to Meaningful Interviews, Part 2 with Rabbi YY Keller. The first part was fascinating. We only got a glimpse of your knowledge about the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, and it also sheds light about his life and what type of tzaddik he was. We're going to talk now a little bit about your knowledge, and as an author of over 20 books, these are just two of the books called the Sefer Shal Zechuvas Avnei Chaim, Miraboni Mishpachas Chaim L'Dereseyim, Chabad, famous Chabad family, the Chaim family, many of them great Talmud Chachamim, Rabbanim, rabbis, scholars. So Rabbi Keller put together their response in here. And this one's Val Ma'ir Oir. These are questions that Rabbi William Mashliach in Portland asked Rabbi Keller, who is a maven, a big expert in the Rambam, and he wrote this up. So what I want to get at is, I've had conversations with you over the years. Those topics, like, you don't find your average Rosh Yeshiva discussing, even in the greatest Litvish yeshivas, Chassidish yeshivas, Panovich, Lakewood, Chveis, Mir, whatever, it doesn't make a difference. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've discovered in the Talmud? The Talmud, everyone talks about the Talmud. That fascinates you. Besides a good pshat in Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos. But tell me a little bit about the Arum, the circumference of the Talmud. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so what's interesting about the Talmud, there's as you say, the Arum of the Talmud. In other words, how was the Talmud written? Was it written? And so on and so forth, which is a discussion in itself.
Well, what does that mean? What do you mean, was it written?
So if you ask your typical Rosh Yeshiva or Magachir or layman, and you'll ask him, so who wrote the Mishnah? And he'll say, of course, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi.
Correct.
Now, actually, what's interesting is that not only that Rashi and Rav Shira Goyen insist that the Mishnah was not written, but Rambam,
written by
Rabbeinu HaKadosh.
It was written by someone, but not by him.
Definitely written over the years, but according to them, not only wasn't it written by Rabbeinu HaKadosh, it wasn't even written during his era. It was written much later.
When does Rashi say this?
So it comes out from Rashi. Now, about Rashi himself, whether he holds that way or not, the Rebbe wants to argue that there's no conclusive proof that Rashi holds so. The Rebbe has it in Chilik Yud Beis and Achrei.
Okay.
But Rav Shira Goyen clearly states, Rav Shira Goyen was preceded both the Rambam and Rashi, and he actually, when we talk about learning and knowing something by heart, usually nowadays it would mean a person took a written text, memorized it, and now he knows it by heart.
Yes.
But Rav Shira Goyen tells us that he studied the Talmud by heart from somebody who studied it by heart, going all the way back to Ravina Rav Ashi. They didn't use written text, period. And in the times of Rav Shira and Rav Hai Goyen, it was already recorded in writing. But they did not use that system. Now, the earliest record that we have about a written Gemara, Talmud Bavli, is from a few hundred years after the Talmud Bavli was sealed. And the Talmud
closed.
Yeah, the Talmud Bavli was sealed in the year 499. Not only do we know the year, which is the Hebrew year Hey Aleph from Reish Samach, 5260. Not only do we know the year, but we know the exact date. And even
how do we know that?
Because Rav Shira Goyen tells us. And what's interesting is there is a famous statement, Rav Ashi v'Ravina Soif Hayra. Rav Ashi and Ravina, they're the end of Hayra, of directive.
Of instruction.
Of the basically instruction of the Talmud. And what's interesting is that there are two Ravinas. There was a Ravina who was at the same time a colleague of Rav Ashi, who passed away either a few years before or after. And there was another Ravina who was a student of Rav Ashi. And Rav Shira Goyen seems to indicate that when we say Ravina of Rav Ashi Soif Hayra, the Ravina who's Soif Hayra is the one who was a student of Rav Ashi, who passed away 73 years later. And his passing made it Soif Hayra, because it seems that he was the last student, the last Mekabel from Rav Ashi. There was Marbar Rav Ashi, other Rosh Yeshivas that were Mekabel from Rav Ashi, but he was the last who was Makabel from Rav Ashi, and
Okay.
as such, when he passed away, that was Sefer.
Okay, so are we to walk away thinking that the Talmud, it wasn't recorded? What is the conclusion by
Okay,
most?
so here is an interesting thing that I noted. Obviously, we learn Rambam. We keep learning Rambam every year.
Right.
Some people finish it once in 3 years. That the Rambam in his introduction makes it very clear that even he who states and insists, as Rav Saadia Gaon does, that it was written in the days of Rebbe, but the Rebbe himself did not write it. He merely taught it orally. So this is interesting, and Rav Shir Gaon obviously was taught the Mishnah and the Talmud orally.
So
And they had a whole system. You can imagine that they had a whole system where you had 60 people that everybody memorized one Masechta, those that had Talmud with the Talmud, those that didn't have the Talmud without the Talmud. And you would walk, if you wanted to, you had a question, besides for the Gaon, who was the Rosh Hashiva, who knew all 60 Masechtas, right? But if you had a question in one particular Shabbos, for instance, you would walk over to Mr. Shabbos, who was known for his backwards and forwards in Maseches Shabbos, or Mr. Brachas, who would give you the backwards and forwards in Brachas.
that's very interesting. So the average person at the time was an ignoramus, right? Had no idea about these things.
No. What's interesting is that in the times of the Gemara, and we know even at the times of the Gemara, that all the balabatim, your average person who was a farmer, and throughout the year he was working, 2 months a year, they would stop work.
Oh, they did
It was the
Yarchi Kala.
months they called Yarchi Kala. Kala means gathering. Yarchi is the month of, and these are the month of Adar and Elul, where everybody would come, all the farmers, everybody would come to the gathering, and they would learn with the greatest sages.
How did they support their family during that time?
Well, obviously, they made, just like the Torah has a system of shvis,
Yes.
where basically it's meant to be that during the 6 years, you take
Right,
care,
and then it blesses the
so
seventh.
the same thing.
Anyways, they came for Yom. So you're saying that everyone learned at least 2 months a year.
2 months a year, they all come to Bes Medrash.
That's very interesting. So
So much so that Rabbi was persecuted for that by the Persian government at the time, because somebody told the king that he's nullifying he's stopping all these people from working for those 2 months.
right. Okay. Now, the Talmud, as it developed,
Yes.
Were there periods where people were more involved and interested in it and then less involved? In other words, what we have today, and not today, but already a long time, is there's some that, challenge the authenticity of the Talmud, which is ridiculous, but I'm asking if that same idea existed at that time, 2,000 years ago.
There was nobody to challenge because you could see the live Beis Medrash. You walk into Surah and you walk into Pumpadisa and you see here's the live discussions that are taking place.
Where is Surah and Pumpadisa today?
Okay, so Pumpadisa, I think it's Najaf. I believe Najaf is Pumpadisa. Pumpadisa means it's at the river of Bedisa. Pum is the opening of Bedisa. And I believe Naharda is Karbala. I might be wrong on these specific, but we know it's known where Naharda and Pumpadisa are.
Nardo, yeah.
Nardo. Now, what's interesting about Nardo is Nardo was an autonomy of the Jewish people in Bavel. Even before the great, we know, well, they never stopped the yeshiva. When the first Jews were exiled in Bavel, at the end of Bayis Rishon, King Yechonia, it says, HaChorosh v'Hamasker, the carpenter and the woodworker, and the Chazal tell us HaChorosh v'Hamasker means Talmidei Chachamim. He took them to exile, so the yeshiva started right away. So, but the Gemara makes a whole thing in Gemara Gittin that Miki also Rav LeBavel, from when Rav came to Bavel. And Tosfos says, well, there were yeshivas in Bavel before Rav came.
Right.
But it seems that there were 2 different types of yeshivas. Because, let's go back to the time of, now what's interesting is about the kings, the rulers of that whole area of Babylonia, whether it was the Babylonians or the Parthians, they recognized
Who are the Parthians?
I don't know, but they were people who were there before the Persians.
Okay.
The Parthi is maybe named after the Euphrates River, I'm not sure, which is in Hebrew is called Prus. But in any case, these people, they recognize that the Jewish people are loyal And if you allow them the autonomy that they can have their own judges and they can work their own system, they'll provide the protection, they'll provide the army to Naharda was a walled city. So it was basically...
So where is this Nardo today? Where is it?
It's in Iraq.
It's in Iraq. And Pumbedisa is where?
This is also in Iraq.
Iraq.
Surah is also in Iraq.
They're all
As a matter
Iraq.
of fact, Iraq is basically, northern Iraq is Ashur, Assyria. And in southern Iraq is Bavel, Babylonia, which used to be called Shinar in the times of Chumash.
Right. So would you say that most Jews lived in this area?
So this was the capital, not most Jews, but a lot of the wealthier Jews lived in
Iraq.
Within Iraq, the yeshiva was in Naharda. The big yeshiva was in Naharda. So much so, when Rav, who was a famous Talmud his name was Rav Abba, and he was called affectionately by his students Rav. And when he came down, he descended to Bavel in the year 219. Rav Shir Goin tells us when he descended, that's how we know. When he descended to Bavel, just about the time that Rebbe passed away, before Rebbe passed away, he already instructed, Rabbi already told that my nephew is coming down to Bavel. But in any case, the famous, when a rabbi receives smicha, we say yoida yoida or yodin yodin.
Yes.
It's part of this conversation that Rav Chia sends first when Rabbi Bar Bachonas descends to Bavel. And he says, when Rav descends to Bavel, he says, Yoida, should he teach? Yes, Yoida, he should teach. Yodin, should he judge? Yes, Yodin, he should judge. However, Yater B'chayrais, we know the firstborn, there's a whole issue, he shouldn't be involved in that. And about Rabbi Bar Bachana, he said he should also be Mater B'chayrais. But in any case, so Rav came down to Naharda, and Rav Shilo was the Rosh Yeshiva at the time. Rav was a greater scholar, but obviously when Rav Shila passed away, Shmuel wanted Rav to become the Rosh Yeshiva. He was the greater student of Rebbe, who learned by him for many years. Where Shmuel, we know he was in Israel, he was Rabbi's doctor, but that maybe for a year or two.
He was what, Rebbe's?
He was Rebbe's doctor at one point. But that was maybe for a year or two, but he was mainly studied in Bavel. And Rav says to Shmuel, no, you've studied here all the time, you should be Rosh Yeshiva. So Rav went to Suda, which at that time was a place that didn't have Torah, where the people, as you say, were ignoramuses, as the Gemara states certain things that happened over there. And Rav established the yeshiva over there. So he established the yeshiva of Balabatim. People are involved with the world, but they're learning also. So that was a different type of yeshiva.
I want to ask you,
so these were the two academies. When we talk about the Gaonim, why do we call the Gaonim and they call it the Gaonic era? Why are they called
because
Gaon?
Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Shiri Gaon.
Rav Hai Gaon is one of the least Gaon of an international stature. There were Gaonim in Bavel later afterwards, but they didn't have international stature. When I'm saying international stature, it means that people used to ask them questions
from all over.
And that ended with Rav Hai.
Okay, but what's your question? You were asking why is it called the Gaon?
Why is it called Gaon? So we say that Gaon is numerical value of 60, and it means that there's 60 Masechtas. But the real
60 volumes of the Talmud.
60 different Masechtas of Talmud,
right?
Called volumes, depends. But in any case, the word, it's a really abbreviation of the full title, which is Rosh Yeshivas Gaon Yaakov. In other words, the name of the academy, at least in the Gaonic era, was Gaon Yaakov, Jewish pride. The Talmud was the Jewish pride. These are scholars, these are people who learned. And it was,
where does it say this name?
In letters that were addressed to them. You see, when we have the original letters, it mentions Rosh Yeshivas Gaon Yaakov.
Interesting.
From them or to them.
Yes. So that's they were called Gaonim.
That's why they were called Gaonim.
Now let me ask you a personal question. Have you gone through the Talmud?
I've gone through many Masechtas.
Do you have a desire to learn the entire Talmud?
Absolutely.
Okay. But you do not learn the Daf HaYomi, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
There was a time, I remember my father-in-law took me, we came along to one of the Siyumim in Madison Square Garden in 2005, I believe. And then I made a decision. I learned with my father-in-law, who's been learning Daf Yomi for many years. And I learned with him brachas and Shabbos, and we started Erev. And so, as long as I was learning with him, I learned Daf Yomi. But other than that, I don't.
Right, your father was Reb Simcha Pekarsky.
My father-in-law is Reb Simcha Bunim Pekarsky, the son of the former Rosh Hashiva.
My Rosh Hashiva. He gave me smicha. Okay, I want to ask you a question. What's the thing that most impressed you from your learning of the Talmud? Which one thing, if you had to say, this is something that impressed you most?
So what's interesting about the Talmud is that everything is to be found in Talmud. History, geography, creation, physics. If you want to know astronomy, if you want to know, the Gemara says in Pesachim, Daf Tzadik Dalid, the circumference of the world is 6,000 parsa. Parsa is 4 mil, which would be, you would say, okay, 24,000 mile seem to be thing. But what's interesting is, we know a mile is how many feet? It's 5,280 feet. Now the word mile is a Latin word, it means 1,000. It's supposed to represent 1,000 steps. Now nobody can take a step that's 5 feet. Not me, not you, not somebody else.
Right.
So why would you take a unit of 5,280 feet and call it a mile? What sense would it mean? And it seems to me, when I was studying the Talmud, that this is based on this statement in the Talmud, because the Rambam also mentions this amount, that 24,000 mil. And he says that if you don't know this, if you don't acknowledge this, you don't know science. So obviously he's not quoting from the Gemara. The Gemara themselves, they say that this statement they learned, and obviously it means they learned from some science books. So what is he referring to? The Ptolemaios, the astronomer, the earliest astronomer that we have, he was an Egyptian astronomer who wrote in Greek, and he was in the times of the famous Tanoim, Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi, in the year 3900, which is, and in the English, in the secular count, it's 140. And in that year, he wrote his astronomical book, and he also wrote a book on geography. And in his introduction to the book of geography, he writes that the circumference of the world is 180,000 stadiums, or what racetracks, which were stadiums. In Hebrew, we call them ris. We say that a mil is 7.5 racetracks, 7.5 ris. It's brought in the Mishnayos and Yuma. And so obviously 180,000 racetracks, that's 24,000 mil. Now, if you look at the circumference of the earth, it's a little more than 24,000 miles. Why is it so? This has to do with the concept of a ruler. We all know if we want to measure something, we go to a ruler. Now, why do we call a measuring stick? Why do we call it a ruler? Because we would talk about feet. Everything is measured by feet. And the question is, whose feet? My feet or your feet? They're different. So the way it will work, it would go by the feet of the ruler. So imagine that there's a ruler who's ruling over England, and then he dies and his son takes over, and his son has shorter feet. Now the amount of whatever yards, which is all multiples of feet, is shorter or longer. So it was, when it was standardized somewhere in the 18th century, they took the last ruler who probably had one of those shorter feet, because a foot really is related to the unit of an amma. An amma is explained. Amma is the middle finger. It's the amount that's from the tip of the middle finger till the elbow, which is just about 48 centimeters, or a drop less. The Rab Chaim Noah clocks it at 48 centimeters. It seems that according to the Rambam, it's a drop less.
Okay.
But in any case, so this is the unit of. The foot is 2/3 of an amma, the original foot.
Okay.
So what happens is, what do we know about this number 5,280 and how it relates to a meal? So we know a meal is fascinating because it has to do with Tchum Shabbos. We know that it says in Parshas B'Shalach.
What is Tchum Shabbos?
Tchum Shabbos means a boundary of Shabbos. Shabbos, a person should not be walking out more than 2,000 cubits from wherever he is, unless he's in a city. If he's in a city, this limit is from the edge of the city.
Right.
But if you're in the desert, it's from wherever you're from your 4 amos, you have 2,000.
Right.
So there's halachic works that were written in the times of the Gaonim. One by Reb Shimon Kayara, which is known as Halachas Gdolos, the big halachis.
Yes.
And another is Halachas Psukos, which there's a discussion whether it precedes, it's from Rav YY Keller, or it precedes the halachas of Reb Shimon Kayara, or it's later. But in any case, there's over here a difference when it mentions the meal versus the ris. And over there it says that 2,000, in Halachas Gdolos it says 2,000 amma is a meal. And a mil is 7.5 ris, and it comes out that the ris is 266 amma, cubits. In Halachas Psukos, it says differently. It says that the 2,000 amma is an amma, and 2,000 amma is a mil and a racetrack. So it comes out that every racetrack is 234 amma. So it comes out that the mil is 1,760 amma. So 1,760 amma is exactly 2,640 feet, which is a half of that meal. So they took a meal and they doubled it, and it has to do with Rashi in Psachim. Rashi says that you would think that 24,000 is the circumference. He says no, 24,000 mil is half the circumference. But they thought that it means...
So why are you telling me all this?
I'm saying because when Columbus, you asked what was fascinating about the Talmud, other than the Talmud. I said when Columbus set sail for America, he didn't know that the world was as big as it is, or he would have never set sail. He thought that it was half the size, and the reason is because it said that it was 24,000 mil, which is 180,000.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Keller, for this wonderful discourse. And this is just a glimpse into the fascinating information in the Talmud. And it gives us the encouragement to study more the Talmud. Thank you very much.